This lesson is going to focus on direct versus indirect writing. So direct and indirect writing are two different strategies or approaches that you can use in your writing depending on the kind of communication you need to give. So this PowerPoint will take you through both the direct and indirect approach. We'll talk about what each of them are and how to use them. We'll also talk about when you would use them and show you some examples, and you'll have the opportunity to practice each. It's important to choose your strategy very carefully. So whether you're writing an email or a memo or any other kind of communication, you want to decide whether you're going to use a direct approach or an indirect approach. Generally, we would use a direct approach when you're expecting that your audience will either have a neutral reaction or they will be happy with the message that you are giving. Or you can also use the direct approach for giving routine everyday messages. An indirect approach, on the other hand, is used when you anticipate that your audience is going to be displeased or upset or unwilling or uninterested in the message that you are giving. So let's focus first on the direct approach. This is used, as I mentioned, when you're giving positive or neutral information, or if you're just presenting information that might be part of a regular day-to-day routine. The format for both direct and indirect include the same components of a subject, an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. But here we're going to focus with a direct approach. In the subject, you state the main idea of the message. Your introduction in your writing will then repeat the main idea. And the body is where you add any other necessary details. So that's where you give the information that is needed. And then you conclude, usually with providing contact information or telling the audience what kind of action steps are needed on their end, whether it's to reply, if they need to attend a meeting, to hand in information, to fill out a form, whatever that might be. Here's an example of a direct approach memo or email. So you can see that the subject line is staff meeting on January 6, 2026. So this just very neutrally states the main idea. You have a greeting followed by the introduction, which repeats the idea from the subject line. Then the body of the message is giving what kind of information is needed. So it's giving only the necessary information. It's not going beyond what's necessary. And then the conclusion is providing contact information and telling the reader what next steps they need to take. There are quite a few benefits to using a direct approach, but there's also some drawbacks. So in terms of benefits, it's efficient because it gets the point of the message across quickly. Generally, the subject line and the first sentence tell you everything that you need to know in a gist. It tells you very quickly what action is required, so the reader is able to respond faster. And the message is very clear, so there's less opportunity for any misunderstanding. The drawbacks of this, however, is that the message can come across as being blunt. It could be perceived as being harsh or overly assertive, and the audience may have some resistance to the message. Your subject line is very important in direct approach communications. So you want to use words that are clearly and concisely describing your topic. That's not giving too much information. You don't need to be informative in your subject line of all the details. You want to just be precise. So say exactly what it's about. The subject line should be one line. Okay, if it's anything longer, then that's the kind of information that needs to be in the body. And remember to be specific. So you're describing an action, you're including a date, perhaps you need an invoice number or a reference number or a course code. So your subject line should be very brief, descriptive, and precise. Now is your chance to practice. So you're going to write a direct strategy message to all workers at your workplace to announce the hiring of 2 additional staff. One is a full-time staff member and one is a manager. And you're going to inform the team that the new employees will begin their work on December 15th, 2025. The indirect approach involves more careful planning than the direct approach because you need to consider how your message is going to be perceived. And this generally comes from delivering bad news. The psychology around this is that hearing the word no can be difficult for some audiences. So especially if you're giving bad news, and especially if you consider this in the healthcare field, you want to be very delicate with the way you deliver bad news. So the goal for delivering bad news is to be considerate of your audience, to give the information. You want to gain acceptance of the news from the audience and reduce the need for further correspondence on the matter. So you don't want to leave the door open for questions or further conversation. So some situations in which you might need to use an indirect approach might be giving negative health news or information about, declining medical coverage, any kind of request that might be denied, a canceled appointment or a delayed appointment, limited supply of resources, any kind of request that's been made, whether it's for time off, changing a shift, working overtime, that is denied would be bad news. So the template for writing in an indirect approach is similar to the direct approach. It's just the way you include these items. So you still have a subject line, but it's going to be neutral. So again, you're still going to kind of include the main idea, but you're not indicating the bad news in the subject line. Then within the introduction of your writing, you're going to begin with a buffer statement. And these are generally some kind of neutral or positive statements. Often an expression of thanks is a very common buffer. And then you're not going to discuss the main idea in that first line, in that buffer. You're going to save that for the body. So in the body, you're going to provide the information, but first you're going to give the background. So that might be reasons, details, or explanations for the bad news. Then you're going to state what that bad news is. And then if it is possible, you can suggest an alternative or future action that might lead to a better outcome in the future. If that's not possible, then you just state the bad news and move on to your conclusion. And then in the conclusion, you include some kind of a goodwill statement. Again, it could be an expression of thanks, or it could be sort of just a general goodwill statement, which we'll see some examples of that in the slides to come. And then you want a courteous closing. And it's really important that you don't invite feedback. So you want to leave it as you've given this information and end it. It doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be requests for more information or questions, but you're not inviting it. So here is an example. So previously with the direct approach, we had a subject line, and here again you can see the subject line is giving the main idea, feedback on PPE. So it's just giving a very general main idea statement. Then you have your first line is your buffer. Here it's an expression of thanks. Thank you for expressing your concern. So it's addressing what the previous communication was and expressing thanks for that. Then you have the body. So you'll remember from the body in the previous slide, it said to provide reasons or explanation. So here we can see that this email is coming in response to an employee giving feedback or making a complaint about the quality of the PPE that's being used. So here the response from management is, we are always looking for opportunities to thoroughly implement employees' feedback. So again, acknowledging the employees' feedback and acknowledging the previous communication. Your letter addresses the quality of the PPE in our office. So stating what the main point of that communication is. Now we go into the explanation. We have carefully examined manufacturers' protocols regarding masks, gowns, and face shields that we are using and have found that they not only meet government recommendation and standards, but provide further protection than mandated by official regulators. Our office will therefore keep using the PPE that we have acquired and that we will continue to supply to all staff in our office for free. So that is the bad news, which might not sound like bad news, but if it's coming as part of a complaint from somebody, it's the opposite of what that person has initially hoped for. So they've addressed the original feedback and offered explanations. Then we have a courteous closing. Your conscientious and caring attitude is indicative of your dedication. So it's, again, sometimes it might be seen as pandering or flattering the audience, but it's a courteous closing, not inviting any kind of further discussion. So let's break down these steps. So as we saw, you start with a buffer. So this is a neutral, non-controversial statement that's just going to relate to the main idea of the message. So these can sometimes be agreement, understanding, or praise, an expression of thanks or appreciation, an expression of fairness, or it could deliver some good news. So if there is good news to deliver, you could maybe start off with that. Then in the body is where you're going to give this bad news, but you're going to do it very carefully. So you're going to lead in by stating background and context information. So whatever information is necessary for the audience to understand the message. So whether that's facts or reasoning or what has brought this topic forward, you're going to begin with that. Then you're going to sandwich the bad news. So you reveal the bad news carefully. Usually you're going to put it in the middle or at the end of your paragraph. So you're going to only put it in the middle if you can move to the third point here, which is listing alternatives or solutions. If there are no alternatives or solutions, then you're just going to end with the bad news. You're going to state it once and you do not repeat it or use apologies. Then in your conclusion, again, you're not going to apologize or repeat what the bad news is. You're not going to invite further discussion from the audience. And then you'll just end with a short goodwill statement. Usually that's some kind of appreciation. Or it could be an acknowledgement of the audience's effort or time. You can also use the indirect approach when you are trying to use persuasive messages. So this could be if you're preparing sales messages, promotional information, if you're trying to do fundraising or volunteering, delivering public health messages, or if you're asking for donation requests or requesting a favor. So in these cases, you would use the indirect approach in a very similar way. Start with a buffer, write the body where you have the lead-in, your main idea and alternatives, and then you write with a clear conclusion and a call to action. A few tips for some persuasive messages. Try to use a sensitive subject line. So you don't want to reveal the main idea right away in the subject line. You could even use a neutral subject line if it's something like a date or a reference of information. When it's possible, you want to use emotional and logical appeals. So this generally means leading with emotion and following with reason. So it goes back to a little bit of psychology where you can hook your audience in with an emotional appeal, and then you kind of seal the deal by following that up with logic and reason. You want to use fact-based evidence to sell your idea. So if there's verifiable data to support what you're saying, use it. Keep your message simple and avoid confusion. Okay, so promote, inform, and persuade on one product or service at a time. The goal is to get a yes, and if you confuse the audience with too much information, you're likely to hear a no. And you want to set your audience up for an effective closing. So you want it to be clear what your audience should do, by when, and how. So your conclusion is there to sum it up and offer solutions or a call to action, motivating your audience to take the next step. The smaller the step, the more likely they are to comply. And it's really important, once you have given that call to action, that final step that they need, you end your message. You don't want to talk past the close. All right, so now it's your chance to practice writing with an indirect approach. So you're going to write an indirect strategy message. You're going to imagine that you are the manager and you are writing to an employee to tell them that the overtime shifts that that employee requested have not been approved. So the bad news is that you cannot work overtime, or this employee cannot work overtime. So you're going to write this message using an indirect approach to deliver this bad news.